Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Sniper Ghost Warrior 3 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. Before we get into the review proper, full disclaimer, I did receive a review copy of this to take a look at. This is a first-person shooter by CI Games that was released in April of this year for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. And even though it is the sequel to Sniper Ghost Warrior and Sniper Ghost Warrior 2, it really doesn't have much to do with either of those prior games other than a few core mechanics that haven't really changed all that much between the three. But that said, it is actually kind of baffling that this game even exists at all, because the previous two Sniper Ghost Warrior games were really not very well received at all, with the very first game in the series being very poorly received, and the second one's reception was more of a this is a very uninspired but technically playable game kind of deal. And with all that in mind, they decided to go for a bit of a different route with this one. They made it an open world first-person shooter. So how does that actually change things up? Well, let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. Well, as far as presentation goes, you gotta keep in mind that this does run on the CryEngine, and they do make pretty decent use of it. The environments in particular are often downright gorgeous to look at. And a lot of that is due to the rather detailed foliage as well as the attention to detail in the sort of Soviet bloc style buildings that they put into this thing, which of course the game is set in Georgia, you gotta keep that in mind. There are also some pretty nice weather effects as well as some rather nice lighting effects that really do help things out when you have the whole day and night cycle thing going on. And on a general level, the modeling and the texture work is pretty decent, although the characters do look almost last gen, which is a bit of a shame. And there are a few textures here and there that definitely look a bit lower res. So while they do definitely take advantage of several of the capabilities of the CryEngine, they don't take full advantage of them, and I think that's mostly due to budgetary constraints. CI Games is definitely not a AAA developer after all, they don't have that kind of budget. And to be fair, what they've achieved with the CryEngine in this particular game is actually rather good for a middle market game. That said, the lip syncing is just downright awful. It actually looks more like it came from the PS2 era than even the Xbox 360 and PS3 era, let alone the current gen. Of course, that's when the game actually decides that there should be some lip syncing for a particular animation cycle, because I have noticed numerous times where there was no lip syncing at all. And even when you factor in the pre-rendered cutscenes, the absolute best it manages to do is basically last-gen lip sync, and even then, last-gen lip sync often was actually better than this. But apart from the lip sync, there's not really anything in the visuals that's going to make you go, ew, that's terrible. It's mostly going to be mild annoyances here and there. For example, the annoying amount of pop-in that numerous amounts of set dressing have, where it doesn't affect the gameplay in any way, but it definitely wreaks havoc on the aesthetics. And of course, there's also things like the bullet cam, where when you get a particularly good headshot, at least according to the game, then it does this zoom mechanic where it zooms in on the bullet as it travels from your rifle into the opponent's head. It's obviously something that they took from the Sniper Elite series, but the thing is that the Sniper Elite series made it much more interesting with the inclusion of the X-ray mechanic, which is just not a thing here. So in this particular game, it ends up being just a missed opportunity and something that is zooming in on a whole lot of nothing, really. It's a bit of a shame. But then when you move past the visuals and you go into the sound design, that's where things start to get a bit messier. The sound effects themselves generally are competent, but nothing particularly impressive. None of the guns have a lot of bass to them, none of the explosions have a lot of bass to them, but they aren't so weak in the bass department that they all sound like pea shooters. Although if you're smart, you're going to be using almost all of your weapons suppressed, so you're not going to be listening to most of the gun sounds anyway. You're going to be listening to the sounds that they make when they have a suppressor on them, which are almost too quiet, actually. It makes them sound much wimpier than they actually are. But while the suppressor sounds are a bit too weak and the gun sounds themselves aren't quite beefy enough, you end up with mostly competent sound effects for everything else. There's nothing that really sounds out of place. But then you move over into the music, which is alright. It's got some tracks in there that are inspired by Georgian folk music, even if they aren't necessarily actual Georgian folk music, and that both fits in rather well due to the setting, and also adds a bit of uniqueness to the soundtrack, because otherwise you're dealing with some tracks that sound like they're from just about any other modern military shooter out there, and are rather uninspired. But then you get to the voice acting, which ranges from absolutely awful to bad, to just somewhat passable. Some of the lines are just absolutely cringe-inducing, some of the accents are kind of ridiculous, and you end up with most of the dialogue just being very uninterested actors reading a pretty crappy script. But unfortunately, the voice acting never gets so bad that it ends up being funny. It's just bad to the point of being kind of annoying. But voice acting aside, the rest of the presentation is actually fairly competent. It's just that certain elements here and there are a bit messy, and what you end up with as a whole is a mixed bag. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you take on the role of Jonathan John North, who is sent on a mission into Eastern Europe along with his brother, and his brother ends up getting captured and John ends up getting knocked out before you go to a time skip of 2 years later when John is now being sent into Georgia to destabilize the Georgian separatists there, who it turns out have been receiving a pretty ridiculous amount of funding and resources, and you're trying to find out who exactly is financing them, and at the same time trying to tear their organization apart from the inside out. During all of this, you're also searching for John's brother Robert, who went missing after he got captured by that mysterious individual who ended up knocking John out. Assisting John in his escapades are his handler Frank Sims, his former lover Lydia, and later on an Israeli agent named Raquel, who is also in the region conducting her own operations. Now, most of the time you spend the game going from place to place, gathering intel or disrupting operations or eliminating specific targets, and eventually it introduces something called the 23 Society, which is introduced as this kind of mysterious rumor kind of thing. And to go any further into the story would really start to spoil things, but in order to avoid spoilers, I'm not going to go into specifics here. I am going to talk in very general terms, however, about the big plot twists that they put into this game that you can pretty much see coming from a mile away, and ultimately ends up being one of those "did you really think this was a good idea" kind of plot twists. The second you come across the revelation in the storyline, you instantly facepalm and go, "Really, guys, you went there? This was not only predictable, but incredibly stupid." And it highlights something that is actually a pretty major problem with the game as a whole. If this game was only about John going into Georgia to destabilize the separatists, then it would be a considerably more interesting and ultimately stronger plot. Because then it would actually gel with the gameplay mechanics and you would have a narrative reason for doing everything that you're doing, as opposed to having only a tangential reason for doing what you're doing. And what you're going to be doing in this particular game is basically playing a Far Cry game in everything but name, and of course with the different sniping mechanics thrown in. But worse than simply being that is that Sniper Ghost Warrior 3 is basically an amalgam of a lot of different gameplay mechanics taken from a lot of different sources, smashed into one particular game without any real rhyme or reason to it. You have the sniping mechanics from the previous two Sniper Ghost Warrior games, which is perfectly fine, but it's very comparable to Sniper Elite, and I would actually argue that Sniper Elite is a generally more satisfying sniping experience, simply because you have that really visceral satisfaction of the X-ray system in those games, whereas in this one, the most you get is a camera that zooms in on a bullet as it travels into a ragdoll, and that's pretty much it. Now that said, the sniping mechanics do have some depth to them, and they do make the game a bit more interesting, because you have to adjust for elevation, you have to adjust the zoom factor on your scope to get a better view of things, and you also have to adjust your shot based on the wind and the weather conditions. Ballistics do actually play a factor here, and that actually makes the shots a lot more interesting to take, because then you actually have to be careful, take your time, and plan things out. This makes the actual moments when you're sniping a lot more interesting than everything else in the game. Because if you delve into anything but the actual sniping, the best it manages is the absolute basest competence. Using the secondary weapons, which amounts to several assault rifles, a couple of shotguns, and a couple of compound bows, as well as using the sidearms, which is only pistols of various kinds, whether it be semi-automatic or revolvers, is much the same as using those types of guns in just about any other modern military shooter out there, where it takes a very minimal number of hits to bring an enemy down. In most cases, it only takes one shot if you get a headshot, although certain enemies are very heavily armored and they'll take multiple shots to bring down instead. Although if you do use those secondary weapons or sidearms, you do have to be rather careful, because you are basically made of tissue paper and you can take almost no damage before you go down. Unlike in most modern military shooters, you do not have regenerating health here. You actually have to use healing items to replenish your health bars, which all go down rather quickly, so you gotta be very careful with when you actually run out guns blazing and when you don't. This means that the primary focus of the game is on the stealth aspects, which basically involves, are you crouched? If so, are you in the enemy's line of sight? If not, then they basically can't see you or hear you. If you are walking or running, then they'll probably hear you, and if you're walking in front of their line of sight, then they're definitely going to spot you. Obviously, enemies will react if they see one of their comrades lying dead on the ground. They'll run over to them to see what exactly happened. They might raise the alarm, in which case you definitely want to be very careful, because otherwise you'll probably have mortar strikes raining down on your position, because whenever the enemy spots you and raises the full alarm and you actually see their indicators go red, it basically means they all know exactly where you are. Now the funny thing about that is, if they do call in a mortar strike, all you really have to do is move from whatever location you're in right now to any other location, and that mortar strike will just continue where you were and not follow you. In fact, the enemy AI is kind of dumb in that they won't follow you very much either. If they're taking cover, then they're going to stay in cover for the most part, and it becomes very easy to flank and eliminate enemies that are actually taking cover. Of course, in doing that, you do have to be rather careful, because the enemy tends to be pretty pinpoint accurate when they shoot at you for some baffling reason. But the problem is that the game never really balances its stealth and combat mechanics. You end up with combat mechanics that almost make the game too easy, and stealth mechanics that are barely even functional. Which becomes a pretty nasty problem for certain missions, because they do that old, very tired mechanic of, oh, guess what, on this mission, if you raise the alarm, instantly you fail and you have to start from the last checkpoint. I thought by this point we had all agreed that that particular brand of mandatory stealth is infuriating and should not be included in any game ever. You should always be able to make up for your mistakes. Now, it's not necessarily supposed to be easy to make up for your mistakes, but you should at least be able to do so. Maybe you run out of the area and then come back later when the alarm has died down, or maybe you eliminate certain enemies and then turn off the alarm, and then everybody else is like, oh, well, I guess nothing else happened there, so they go back to whatever they were doing before. But nope, in this one, certain missions, the alarm goes off and immediately you get a game over screen. And the sad part is that the game actually gives you quite a lot of gadgets to play around with to make things a bit more interesting. I mean, you have a drone that you can send up to scout things out, which can mark enemies and of course go into night vision and thermal vision modes if you want to. Although it does have a limited battery life, and it does actually create quite a bit of noise, so it is fairly easy for enemies to notice it unless you are very careful with the way you use that thing. You can swap between numerous different ammo types that gives you quite a lot of versatility. For example, one of the ammo types actually allows you to get pinpoint accurate shots no matter what the conditions are, although you can only carry 5 of those at a time. There's also ammo types that, for example, will apply a tracking effect to enemies or will lure enemies toward a certain location, and you can make good use of those if you really want to, but for the most part I just ended up sticking to normal ammunition. I found that I never really needed anything else. Hell, I didn't even need most of the gadgets. The only ones I really needed were the suppressor repair kits, because unfortunately they did put suppressor degradation into this game and you have to repair your suppressors constantly for them to be effective. Otherwise, eventually the suppressor will actually break and then you'll be stuck with a weapon that actually is very, very loud, probably in a situation where you don't want it to be loud. And I also found some use out of the healing items because, as I mentioned before, you're basically made of tissue paper and any damage you take is going to be absolutely devastating to you. But beyond those, pretty much everything is very situational and you're barely going to have any chances to use most of it. For example, they give you quite a few different mines to play around with and be able to lure enemies into traps with, except that there's really no reason to do so. You don't get any real advantage out of doing that, other than, haha, I just messed with the really bad AI. Most of the time, I just ended up sniping enemies from a long distance away, and if that raised the alarm and they suddenly were all hunkering down, then I would just go in with my assault rifle and sidearm and just pick off the rest without any real trouble. It ended up being a situation where it became abundantly clear that unless you really go out of your way to use all of the equipment, most of it is effectively useless. So even though you do actually have quite a few options of gadgets and gizmos to mess around with and actually tailor to your playstyle, unfortunately there's nothing that's going to beat the just good old-fashioned snipe them from a long way away, and if that doesn't work, then run in and mow them down with machine gun fire. This ultimately makes the combat something you'd probably want to avoid simply because you don't want to get involved in the very tedious process of just mowing down everything in your path. Because, I mean, for most enemies, it's not like you're having to actually employ any intelligent tactics. All you have to do is point and click. The weapons all barely have any recoil to them, and what you end up with is a situation where it's just pathetically easy to get tons and tons of headshots without even really putting any effort into it. So right off the bat, the three main components of the game, the stealth, the combat, and the sniping, are all either broken in the case of the stealth, or incredibly easy in the case of the combat, or just alright in the case of the sniping, because that still becomes fairly tedious after a while. So what does that leave for the rest of the game? Well, the mission structure is fairly non-linear in that you can just kind of go around and do whatever you want in the world, as long as whatever you want involves going from place to place, climbing on things, maybe finding mechanical parts or whatever in order to craft items that you can use for ammunition or for your various gadgets or whatever, as well as eliminating side targets in whatever way you see fit, and just generally going around clearing out outposts. In other words, basically just one-off side activities that have really no effect on anything whatsoever. And as far as any additional mechanics go, well, you can travel from point A to point B either by fast traveling between already discovered fast travel points, or you can hop in your 4x4 and drive around, and driving is slow, tedious, and the controls for it are a bit floaty. In fact, I generally found that more time was spent just driving from point A to point B than was actually spent doing anything that could be construed as interesting. Much like many other open world games out there, this game does not make very good use of its open world, and it ultimately ends up being a matter where they should have just had numerous missions all smacked together that give you a lot of different opportunities to mess around with things, as opposed to just plopping you in a large open world and saying, okay, go nuts. Because what is there to do in this open world? Well, you have your main missions, you have a few side missions that are very basic and really not all that interesting. You have the marked targets that you need to take out, you have outposts to take out, and you have collectible hunting. And that's it. There's nothing else to the open world here, so it's not like you actually make any real use out of it. It becomes a hindrance more than anything else, and it becomes very painfully obvious that they didn't really know what they wanted to do with the open world, other than say, oh, well, it's something we can check on the boxes of it's a modern game now, right? Well, here's the thing. Just because you can make your game open world doesn't mean you should. If you have nothing to put in that open world to make it worthwhile, then just don't do that. Otherwise, what you'll end up with is a game that just feels like it has a lot of disparate elements just slapped together to make something they think is coherent, but ultimately is not. I mean, you have the fairly in-depth sniping mechanics from the previous two Sniper Ghost Warrior games, which are definitely appreciated, but then you have these stealth mechanics and combat mechanics more akin to something like Far Cry, only a hell of a lot easier in the case of the combat, and a hell of a lot more broken in the case of the stealth. You have driving, which is utterly pointless to the game other than to simply take up a large amount of your time. You have side activities that really add absolutely nothing to the game other than some pointless busy work to do. And on top of that, they even put in something called Scout Mode, which is basically just Witcher senses if you've played The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. You hold the button down and it will make the screen look a bit different, and you'll be able to spot certain things like tracks or certain elements of the environment that you can then analyze to get more information and basically just follow a trail of breadcrumbs until eventually you find whatever it is you're trying to find. There's even a small mini-game that is nothing more than a QTE that you use to disarm mines. It's just pathetic. You end up with a game that feels like an amalgam of a lot of different titles, but really doesn't have any real identity of its own. And on top of that, there's absolutely nothing that this game does exceptionally well, and more importantly, there's not even really anything it does well. Apart from some elements of the presentation, the best it really manages is bare competence, and even then, most of the game is actually slightly below that. It's a real shame because they did actually have quite a big opportunity to really take this series forward and make it something that's actually worth playing, as opposed to what they had in the previous two games, which were complete messes. Here, what you ultimately end up with is a game that is certainly playable and does have a decent amount of content in it, but unfortunately none of that content is really all that interesting. It takes what should be a really interesting premise and ultimately squanders every last bit of potential that it had. Even the 2 DLC missions that come with the game, which are the Escape of Lydia and Sabotage, are really nothing to write home about. They're really nothing at all different from what you were doing in the base game, and admittedly that's understandable, but when you get down to it, it means that the 2 side missions there are really just that. They're side missions that really do not add all that much to the game. And on top of that, they're both rather short, so they don't even really have much opportunity to add much to the game. And when you take those 2 side missions and you put them together with the base campaign, what you ultimately end up with is just a whole package that is unfortunately rather subpar. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly playable, but that's really all it manages to be. It's not really enjoyable in any real sense, and what you ultimately end up with is a game that's just flat out boring. And it's precisely because of that that I ultimately give this a 2 out of 5. And the sad part is, the developers had an opportunity to redeem the franchise here, but instead, what they gave us was a mind-numbingly tedious slog of a game. Thanks for watching.